Welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program, and we want to thank you for joining us today. I'm Daniel Davis, your host, and we're going to be we are celebrating Asian Heritage Month. I think I was thinking I was supposed to speak Chinese there just to be able to bequeath the idea that I respect the culture itself. But anyway, joining us today by phone, and actually he's down in Mexico as I understand that, is Peter Heller, and he's the author of a new book called Hell or Highwater, talking about the journey down the Sangpo River in Tibet. And I'm telling you, just to give you an idea of this, it's one thing when you want to go ahead and ascend the summit of Everest. Then it's another thing that once you get to the peak, that you jump into a kayak and just go down Everest, down to the very lowest base camp that you can imagine. And that kind of gives you an idea of, I guess, the journey that we're about to talk about here, that these 7 gentlemen took down the Sangpo River. And what I'd like to do, because there's not a whole lot that I could describe because I myself haven't been to the river, I want to give the listeners an opportunity to understand just what a task this was. And joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is our guest, Peter Heller, and he's going to talk about this adventure as he was there along with everyone else to make sure that this thing succeeded to its best intention. And Peter Heller, thank you for joining us here on the radio program today.
I'm glad to be here.
Now, the first glimpse and the only glimpse that I've ever had of the Sangpo River was in a documentary. It was actually a celebration of National Geographic called 2,000 Amazing Moments in Time, where this mythical waterfall, this hidden waterfall, was alleged to be found, and they actually found it. And here you just see the sheer volume of water coming out of this that made Niagara Falls look like something coming out of your water faucet in the kitchen. So first of all, describe what this river is. It's just amazing what you write about here, and to give folks an idea that the Colorado River could be nothing more than maybe like the Sandy River in Oregon, for instance, compared to its sheer volume.
Yeah, well, this river is both mythic and geographically quite impressive. The Sangpo River flows west to east across the entirety of Tibet. It starts at the headwaters of Mount Kailash, which is a very sacred mountain to Buddhists and Hindus, and it flows all the way across Tibet to the east, draining the north slope of the Himalayas, including Everest. So it gathers a huge amount of water, and then it just virtually falls off the face of the earth. The edge of the Tibetan Plateau, it shears between 2 great mountains, Namcha Barwa and Gyalapuri, and these are 23,000 feet and 25,000 feet. It shears right between them. They're very close together and disappears. And for many, many decades, in Victorian times, the explorers around the world, and especially in the Royal Geographic Society in London, speculated, wondered where did this great river go? And they thought it might become the Brahmaputra, India's great river, or maybe flow further east to the Irrawaddy, which is the river that the mouth of the river just got the horrible cyclone in Myanmar. They didn't know. And the thing about this river is it drops off the Tibetan Plateau at about 10,000 feet, 9,800 feet to be specific in elevation, and 150 river miles later, it emerges, they come to find out years later, as the Brahmaputra at an elevation of 500 feet. So you can imagine a river that starts at 10,000, just 150 river miles later comes out at 500 feet in the hills of Assam, India. So here you've got this incredible sort of cataract, this great drop through a hidden gorge. And in those times, nobody had, in Victorian times, no one had come close to penetrating the gorge. And there's a great history there we can talk about later in terms of the discovery of this waterfall. But I just have to tell you that drop engendered speculations of waterfalls that were like Niagara or Victoria. And this place is so hard to get to, so remote, so impenetrable, that it was only documented in 1998 by that National Geographic team who went in there and measured it.
Now, I know that, in just talking about that film alone, anybody that I actually even loaned that to, I said, here, you got to take a look at this, but, I kept my mouth shut about that particular scene. And consistently, every single time, people would say, that scene with the waterfall was just awesome. You know what I mean? Because you could really feel the power of this gigantic sleeping giant within a, like you said, an area that is almost literally inaccessible. So it goes to unfold the beautiful mysteries that we have here on our planet. And then all of a sudden, here you got 7 daredevils, kayakers, that decide, you know what, it's not a matter that we're going to conquer this, but we want to explore this now. Tell us how all this came together.
Yeah, it's really kind of unbelievable. So this gorge is now, it's 3 times deeper than the Grand Canyon, if you can imagine. It's 3 miles deep. Wow. And the Grand Canyon, if you look at the Grand Canyon in cross-section, it kind of, steps back. It's kind of, you start at the river and you go up a step and then step wider and go up a step wider. So, it's not sheer at all. Whereas this river, you can stand at 8,000 feet on the river and look straight up and see the tops of 23,000-foot peaks. So,
so it's embedded down there.
It is unbelievable, sort of chasm. And the great thing about this gorge, the great thing biologically about it is that you go from subtropical in the bottom of this gorge, where there are tigers, there are hundreds of species of banana trees that, many haven't even been described yet, 4 species of leopards, and you go straight up from that into temperate to Arctic to Alpine to Arctic, all within 3 miles. So you have this, it's one of the 3 most biodiverse places on Earth, this gorge. And it was also the inspiration for Shangri-La, the sort of mythic place, and that where, people could live forever and all that. And that started because in Buddhism, this gorge is very, very sacred as a sort of pilgrimage destination. And it cradles a region called Pemmico, which is very mysterious. And since ancient times, Buddhists believed in Tibet that there's an ancient text that says even taking 7 steps with pure intention towards Pemmico, and you will be relieved of, suffering and rebirth in the lower realm. So this place is very, very sacred. Mm-hmm. And it's supposed to be, the gorge is supposed to be the spine of Dorje Pagmo, which is Buddha's consort, and these 2 great mountains are supposed to be her breasts. And so this whole place is very, very sacred. And these guys, the river falls so steeply and has such huge volume that it's kind of beyond the pale of what anybody had ever attempted to kayak. A team of 4 world-class kayakers tried to run the river in 1998, and on mile 27, a really great paddler died, a guy named Doug Gordon, who I knew. And so the problem that they had was that the river is, imagine a river the same volume as the Grand Canyon, but dropping, say, I'd say, 8 feet a mile, 20 times more steeply.
Wow.
It's just beyond the pale.
Right.
The problem these guys had is they tried to load everything in their kayaks and for the long journey, and their boats were very, very heavy and hard to maneuver. So what Scott Lindgren did, this great kayaker, and who had done a lot of exploring and first descents in this part of Asia, he gathered the best 7, including himself, 7 big water kayakers in the world, and decided to do a sort of an ambitious new strategy, two-pronged new strategy, which was, 1, go with empty boats so that they could maneuver very easily and very quickly on that water. And going through that gorge with empty boats, you kind of had to plan on 2 months in the gorge. How are you going to do that? You needed a great big team of porters, like a grand old-style expedition. So that was one thing. And the other thing, he decided to go in the middle of the Himalayan wintertime. Mm-hmm. And that posed its own...
Yeah, because I was going to mention, too, that was the time they also decided, because during the monsoons, you've got a river that's just unfathomable, but they decided to do it in the wintertime where things would be mellower, as if they could get mellower.
Exactly, right. Yeah, because all the tributaries are, mellower.
Mellower.
So to speak,
Mellow out, anyway.
Yeah, exactly. All the tributaries in the wintertime are iced up. The river's at a lower volume, and so they thought they'd try and go then. Well, the problem is that 44 miles in, you've got some of the most intense whitewater in the world for 44 miles, and then the river hits these 2 great waterfalls, one stacked on top of another. There's a 75-foot fall, and then Hidden Falls itself right after that, which is 110 feet. And it hits these waterfalls, and it's in the sheer sort of box box canyon, so there's no way out. There's no way to go down there. And so what do? You have to climb out of the gorge there, and no one had ever attempted to climb out over that pass from the gorge, which is, very, very steep in the middle of the wintertime. I mean, Tibetans don't go near those passes after mid-November, and here these guys were going to be there in February.
Wow.
So that was the challenge, and that's, that was Lindgren's plan. So he started off with 68 porters. This is huge, and that got whittled down pretty quick, believe me. We had a lot of, desertion because it was so tough. And then a ground team of 12, which included 5 Nepalese mountain Sherpas, who had experience on Everest and stuff, who could climb around inside the gorge. And then, these 7 kayakers.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm kind of curious, Peter. Now, I understand that you're a pretty good kayaker yourself, and you were on this expedition, but was the opportunity offered to you to be part of this team, or was that something you decided you didn't want to do? You'd rather just kind of like basically journal what was going on, or what happened there?
Yeah, no. It wasn't even considered by the team leader, Scott Lindgren. I mean, he pulled together the best, 6 other paddlers in the world in big water. And by then, this was in February 2002, so I would have been 42, I think, and I was, well beyond paddling, couple hundred days a year. All the guys on the team were in the prime of their paddling. They were in their mid to late 20s or 30 years old, and they paddled 300 days a year and did, that's what they did.
Oh, okay,
so they were kind of like, the top pros. And by the, I sort of like, there was part of me as I went in to cover this thing, it was just, yearning to get in a boat and on the river. And I got to tell you, after a couple of days of seeing these guys on the water, I was so glad I didn't have to be anywhere near a boat. I mean, this stuff was wild.
Yeah. Now, also to give the listeners an idea about kayaking itself, is that, as you describe in the book Hell or High Water, is the fact that kayaking is an individualist-type sport, but yet here Scott Lindgren was pulling these people together and said, this is something we do as a team, and that's not something you see very often, especially in the sport of kayaking.
Oh, man. I mean, these guys had to work as such a team, because the thing about going down a river like this is the greatest danger to a kayaker in a canyon is going past the point of no return. In other words, you round a corner, and all of a sudden, there's no place to get out on the side of the river. You've got sheer walls, and there's nothing to do but go down, and it's blind. Nobody ever wants to get stuck in a kayak with a huge current going over a blind drop into a heavy rapid that they can't see. So that's the great terror for kayakers. And the only way to sort of get around that on a river that no one's ever done is to work very, very methodically, get out on the bank where you can. And I have to tell you, the bank, it's not like the bank of any river you've ever seen. I mean, the scale of this place, everything was bigger. I mean, it was sort of like Lord of the Rings, that kind of epic scale where
right.
the rocks on the side of the river were the size of houses and elephants. So even, pulling over to get out with these huge boulders was difficult. And so those guys had to kind of like look downstream ahead to where they could see that they could get out. One guy would be the probe. He'd paddle down ahead, and this is just in huge whitewater, and they had a variety of hand signals, and this guy would sort of do this sort of, kind of sign for hand signal direction, navigation, and then the next guys would follow, and they would cover each other. You had to work as a very, very sort of well-oiled machine and team to get down there safely, and these guys were just unbelievable. And I have to say, the one cool thing about these guys is facing water that would just put your heart in your throat, and in a place where even moving along the banks was difficult. These guys never seemed to be anything but, in good humor. They never got stressed out. They were always joking. They were always optimistic, which was, pretty incredible.
Now, I have to ask, because when somebody thinks of extreme sports, they usually think of somebody who's got a super dose of testosterone, a high level of ego that needs to be satisfied, but those things really don't belong in something such as this, where you have to maintain tremendous focus, where you react either by instinct or experience or even a combination of the both to be able to do what these guys did.
Yeah, and you mentioned a really interesting point, because the very first big rapid that got thrown into relief, this sort of solo cowboy versus the team. Steve Fisher's probably, he was voted by, or ranked by, I think it was Paddler magazine, that's right, as the best kayaker all around in the world. The guy's just a phenomenon. He was 26 years old at the time. He's from South Africa, and at the very first big rapid, he just sort of decided on his own to run down the left side of this thing when everyone else had pulled over to the right bank. He paddled over to the left, he got out, he looked it over, he was all by himself way over across the river. He ran down through some pretty tough stuff, pulled over in some clutter of rocks, that would kind of had seething whitewater all through them, took another look, and then plunged over this 15-foot waterfall on the far side of the river, or cascade, and got swept into an eddy, which is a big sort of circling pool along the cliff on the left side, and got flipped and tossed around. And eddy water is very, very confused. It can be, and one of the toughest places to be. And he got pushed up against the wall, and everyone thought he was going to die. And there was only Steve Fisher, this guy, probably the only man on earth could have got himself out. He somehow got his kayak righted, and somehow he broke through this big fence, eddy fence of current. When you have a big current going by an eddy, it creates like a fence, a wall to bust through, and he somehow did it, and he got down, and Scott Lindgren, the leader, was on him like, just bam, right on him, saying, never do that again. We were a team, no more cowboy stuff, and that kind of, that defined it from then on.
Well, it sounds to me, too, as you describe in your book, that these guys were really tight-knit, very close friends. It's almost as though they might even be telepathic as far as the way they know how to communicate with each other, like, I'm in your thoughts, you're in mine, let's go do this thing here. What was it like for you as you were basically coming along, because you weren't actually ever in the water, as I understand it, but you were along the river's edge as much as you could, but then there were some points you just couldn't be, and it became sort of a blind journaling, if you will, and you had to kind of hear things secondhand. But what was your journey like? Because it wasn't so easy for the people who were on land following these guys down the river as well.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if you imagine you're in a canyon, you're kind of, rock hopping, boulder hopping along the shore, keeping up with the kayakers, and then all of a sudden there's just a sheer wall and maybe a big spur, kind of a ridge, sharp ridge coming down to the water, and a cliff. You come up against the cliff and the river bends around it. So what the ground team would do would then be to try and figure out a way to climb up and over and around this thing. And so we would oftentimes spend a whole day covering a couple of miles, just going up, climbing straight up, say 2,000 feet above the river, and trying to, not fall off, and then come back down again and try and meet with the kayak team. The one good thing is we had excellent handheld radios, and these worked really, really well, and so we could almost always, everybody had GPS and a really great satellite map. So the ground team and the kayak team could constantly communicate, and the kayak team could say, okay, we're at this GPS coordinate at this bend, and the ground team could say, we're here, okay, we see where you are, we're going to try and get off the spur and come down and meet you at the next, little beach, cove, or whatever. And it worked out almost all the time. We spent almost every night together, which is kind of amazing. But the porters, having to do this with their loads, weren't exactly that happy, and we had a lot of desertion, and then we had a terrible mutiny towards the end of the trip, which was really scary.
Yeah, the mutineers with the machetes and the knives.
Yeah.
But that seemed to be taken care of with a quick phone call to a Chinese liaison, as I understand.
Yeah, it wasn't quite that way. Well, not really. I mean, the phone call out on the sat phone was like, help, we're about to all be murdered. Send in a helicopter. The guy said, well, guess what? There aren't any helicopters in that part of Tibet. You're out of luck. Do the best you can, and what they ended up doing was forking over $10,000, which they didn't really owe these guys. And so, the team was robbed, but, everybody lived, which was good. I have to tell you, this gorge is home to two of the only Buddhist hunting tribes in the world. I mean, the first precept of Buddhism is do no harm, and, Buddhists don't hunt. And they're the Mampa people and the Congo people, and they hunt these things called tapirs, which are sort of a indigenous bovine that live in the gorge. And, they're very, very sort of isolated tribes, and there are still the poisoners, these are sort of in legend, the poisoners of Sangpo, and down in the lower gorge, there are still villages where people will try and poison, especially a foreigner or a stranger who comes through town, and they do that to get their luck and their good karma. It's kind of a strange idea. So you're in a place, with these tigers, with these leopards, with these, very, very isolated tribes, and that added just a whole another element of interest.
Yeah, I can imagine it would, because I know you were describing in one of the huts where you actually, or houses, if you will, where you were talking about pure grain liquor, and then it was cut with yak butter. And I was thinking, I guess you had the right water to be making something like that with there on the river.
Yeah, and you hope that it wasn't cut with, the poison egg thing that they
So see, here it's bad enough that you got a river that could literally beat the hell out of you into oblivion, but then on the other hand, the land can be just as brutal even if you're just kind of following along. So that's what I would really call a 21st century adventure now. They were able to succeed in the upper part of the river, as I understand, but as they got to the second, I guess the lower part, as you were describing, that's the point where they all decided, we're just going to go ahead and stop right here because it got to be too much. What was that like?
Yeah, so what happens is the river flows, it flows east, and then it hits these waterfalls, and then it makes a great big bend to the north, big loop. And you can't go there's just no way to go from where that straight part ends, the eastern end, up around the loop, because that's where the waterfalls are that block, and then it is just sheer wall canyon below that for about 5 miles, and that's called the Hidden 5 Miles. And that was never even seen by Western eyes anyway until 1993, if you can imagine. And I think there's part of that that's never ever been even seen, except perhaps by satellite. And so there's that, and then you've got the apex of the Great Bend at the north, where a big tributary flows in called the Sangpo, and that's kind of the way out to the road. And then from there, from that apex of the Great Bend, which is very fabled, you have the lower gorge, which is all tropical, and there's little villages that dot the, sort of the top of the walls, and they farm in these little villages, and they have yaks, and all that lower gorge is just huge volume because it takes that other tributary I just described, and so it's even bigger volume. It's just as walled in, and the guys did about a couple of miles of that and then pulled out and said, we can't go further. We're exhausted. They did this incredible portage up over the pass, and we hadn't talked about that, what that was like actually hitting the waterfalls and climbing out. For 4 days, these guys put the kayaks on their back and climbed straight up out of the gorge, and we got to the snow after the first day, and there we were up, just surrounded by snowy peaks, and the next day we had to climb, a whole day of unprotected climbing on 50-degree snow slopes, where we had a mountaineer, a guy from Canada, a famous mountaineer, who cut steps with an ice axe, and everybody just climbed up, the face of these steps. And we didn't have time to protect because we had, some 60 people we had to get up before the snow got mushy in the sun. So you can imagine this long line of people, porters with loads, kayakers with kayaks on their back, climbing unprotected up in these tiny little steps cut out by this ice axe up the snow slopes. It was just unbelievable. I mean, I had never seen anything like that.
Now, it must have been interesting through this whole adventure for all of you, especially the Westerners, that you were in an area that is steeped in Buddhist mysticism, and this is how these people live. It's in an area that is just remote and almost pretty much, it's untouched by any type of civilization or technology. So it's like their spirituality, if you will, seems intact and strong. So what type of influence did that type of spiritual energy, if you will, what kind of influence did that have on you guys? Was there like transformative moments? What was that like for you?
It was, we'd all read about it, but you really, first thing we did on day 5 was find this remote monastery called Pemaka Chung. And it was sort of the end of the earth for monasteries in Tibet. It was the most remote monastery, the final sort of destination. Nobody went beyond that into the gorge, and it was very hard enough to get there. And we found this thing, and it was just kind of, rubble, rock walls. We found an old statue of Buddha. We found a little bowl made out of a human skull, which they use in some ceremonies, all just in the leaves and kind of the dirt. And this monastery was destroyed in 1959. The Chinese say that it was destroyed in the earthquake that they had there then. But many people believe the Chinese destroyed it in an anti-Buddhist pogrom in 1959. So there was that. But then we were in this it got remoter and remoter. The mountains just seemed bigger. The river got steeper. The jungle along the side got more thick and lush. I mean, you have a couple of hundred species of rhododendron in there. Rhododendron, people usually think of as bushes. These were trees like 20, 25 feet high.
Yeah.
And we found tiger tracks and, all this, getting very remote. And then all of a sudden, there's kind of a cry goes out, and someone had found just off the trail a cave. And I'm talking, Dan, in the middle of nowhere, there was a cave, and there were the traces of yak butter candles that had burned all over the rock, and the little piles of grain, ceremonial piles of millet, and then there was a handprint in the rock, which was supposed to be the handprint by legend of Buddha. And, you can't even believe it. You think about these Buddhist hermits in caves, and you can't believe that anyone could have come in that far to pray and to meditate and to, get closer to enlightenment. And it's like something out of some dream or some wild book like like Lost Horizons. And that was really, really moving. And I think what most of the team found, most powerful was that we were in a country whose sort of primary premise for being was to work towards enlightenment. I mean, the whole country is so devout. And, we'd see people just driving in, on our way from Lhasa, driving in towards the gorge. We'd see groups of people who were prostrating down the highway. They were prostrating for months on end to get to Lhasa, to the Zhoukang. And, this was part of their devotion. These people, lived with spirituality. And then to come upon a cave like that in the middle of nowhere and think that someone had climbed up in there just to pray and meditate was very moving.
I could believe it was. And so, in the end, how was the story amongst the seven, and as you were listening and participating, what were they like? Did they feel changed, like to a whole new level of being, or what was that like for them as well?
Yeah, no, these guys have explored all around the world. They've explored in Asia and Buddhist countries and stuff like that, but not, everyone. I'll never forget, Willie Kern was just such a great, he's from Vermont. There were two brothers. That was kind of neat, too. There were two twin brothers on that trip, Willie and Johnny Kern, great paddlers from Vermont, and they had lost their older brother to kayaking. Their older brother was sort of on his way to being one of the greatest kayakers in the world, and he died in Colorado. And so these guys were kind of doing this for their brother. And I'll never forget, kind of walking across the last bridge. We'd come out of the Sangpo, this sort of long trek out towards the highway, and you had to cross these cables on these little wheels over the river, which was a trip, and then cross this footbridge, the first footbridge with Buddhist flags. It was just lined with Buddhist flags. And Willie Kern, carrying his kayak, said, I just wanted that bridge to go on forever and to stay. I just wanted to stay in that gorge forever. I'll never be the same. And I think all those people, all those kayakers felt the same way. I mean, not only had they done the greatest whitewater, not even arguably, but definitely the greatest, most challenging stretch of whitewater ever done in history. They had done it in a place that was very, very sacred to a whole people, and I think they all felt that, and I don't think they'll ever, anybody will ever do the same after that.
I think it's really interesting, to think of these 7 people, and even yourself, because what you had to endure was pretty difficult and even dangerous. But you also think of big wave surfers, people such as Laird Hamilton and the like, and they describe that this is like an area, this is a bastion, this is a way of living that you've got to do to understand how it transforms you to a moment, whereas like one of the teamsters of this kayaking expedition had said, today was a good day. And I mean, to really know what that means.
Yeah, that's such an understatement, that's a neat that you bring up that quote, because that again was Willie Kern. These guys had just paddled, some of the steepest, biggest walled-in whitewater in the world in history, and, that's what he said. He said, yep, today was a good day, Pete. Biggest smile, biggest grin you can imagine, and yeah,
you can imagine
the
swelling of his spirit inside, just going, I want to burst, but I'm just going to have to be humble for a minute.
Yeah, exactly. And then they have such great style. Steve Fisher would get off. He first running down a stretch. Being the probe, the first guy, and he gets out, clambers out in the bank, and looks at me, smiles, and goes, "Only one drop of pee." But yeah, that's the way.
Question, though. I mean, because when people think of kayaking, I'm sure they think of the adventure of it. They see camping. So, did you guys ever roast marshmallows at any point during this journey?
Oh my God! I mean, people would hit camp and basically collapse. It was lucky we had these 5 Sherpas, and these guys were the most. I have to say, they were the best outdoorsmen I've ever seen in my life, anywhere in the world. These guys could come into camp, after the most brutal mountaineering through the gorge. They'd come into camp. It didn't matter if it was raining or whatever, and, make a fire, have sweet tea on before you could blink, have a whole kitchen set up and be making dinner, and, within an hour they'd have a 5-pot meal for everybody hot. So that was really lucky that we had that. Yeah. Camping was sort of like the least of anybody's concern. They just wanted to stuff the food in them and get to sleep.
I was just wondering, with them being so extreme in their adventure, whether they were still, hey, let's have some marshmallows. We're not too brutal for that.
No, what they did do around the fire. That's a good point, because what these guys did do around the fire is tell stories. And sometimes we'd play cards. We had a pack of nude Chinese playing cards, which the portage loved. And we played this game called I don't know if I can say it on the radio, but it's BS. And there were endless rounds of that. But these guys would tell stories, and they were kind of like. It reminded me, if you ever read the Iliad or anything, with these soldiers, the first thing they introduce themselves and say, I'm the son of this who did this and this and this, and I traveled the land and done this and this. They give this sort of long repertoire, and it's a long narrative, and it's neat, and these guys kind of, as they sat around the fire, would do the same thing. They'd talk about rivers and places they'd been, and it was interesting because 7 guys from around the world could know the exact same rock on one bend, on one river in the middle of, Bhutan. And they'd all know the rock. It's pretty incredible.
I just have to ask, because they did approach or see the Hidden Falls, and then you learned about this account secondhand, as I understand. What did you hear?
Yeah, only a few people went over, and none of the kayakers did that. That was a ground team led by Ken Storm and this guy Sharab, who was our kind of head guide from the area. And this thing had been documented in 1998, and Ken Storm, who we were lucky to have along with us on the expedition, was one of the guys to do it, with an great Tibetan scholar and explorer named Ian Baker. They were the 2 that actually had documented the waterfall. So Ken sort of had done that trek. He knew the way. He and Sharab led a small group into the falls. They rappelled down into them and photographed them again. And, apparently it was just very, very, very moving for all concerned. I mean, this fall tumbles, 110 feet. It takes this entire river. I mean, imagine a river that drains entire Tibet, including the north slope of the Himalayas, squeeze it down to about, 20 yards across and send it over a waterfall. Can you imagine the power? Yeah. And at the bottom of the falls, in the rock across the river in the cliff, is a keyhole. It's kind of a keyhole cave. And that keyhole is supposed to access, other worlds, better worlds. and everybody who saw that thing was, very, very moved. So it was kind of nonstop.
Well, yeah, it's just picturing what you had experienced enough. Just you can feel and hear and almost smell and taste the whole adventure itself, and it might lead some people to think, I might want to try that, but this certainly isn't a tourist destination by a long shot. But I understand that they're sort of on a sad note that they're starting to clear out, as you were talking about those hunter tribes. What's going on with that?
Yeah, I haven't had an opportunity since then to go back there, but what we heard and what I've since confirmed is that the Chinese had, in their efforts to centralize and control the Tibetan people, they have centralized the government and control the people. They have basically depopulated the Gorge of all these villages that have been there hundreds of years, of these hunting tribe people. And it's tough to imagine. There's these beautiful villages perched above the river in the lower gorge. There's banana trees, there's fields of millet, and there's yaks, and people living, and they do some hunting, and there's people living a very, very simple life, and there's a lot of, tall Buddhist prayer flags. Buddhism is a part of daily life there, and, it's kind of hard to imagine going back to that village and having it be ghost town, being empty, and the wind is supposed to, on those prayer flags, the wind is supposed to take the prayers away to, with the intention of the prayers, and take the prayers out into the universe. And it's kind of hard to imagine all those prayer flags fluttering, loosing their prayers into the universe and no one around. It's strange.
I know, even as strange as when I was reading about that they were going to dam up the Yangtze River, and you realize how much that's going to cause this thing to rise, and all the ancient temples and villages that now will become nothing more than a memory maybe etched in stone somewhere. And as anthropologist Wade Davis had said, that's part of a destroyed language of the human experience that no longer will be experienced again. And it just seems sad that in an area that you folks were all at, like the last wild frontier that really can't be conquered, but to a degree it was explored anyway, not conquered, that same thing just might happen again. And it's like, when do we stop and start saying, why don't we not allow this to happen, but allow it to continue, so that way we can find the deepest expressions of our own potential of who we are. And it's just wonderful that people like you took the opportunity to be with this expedition, to share that so that people knew that these people did in fact exist, that they were here.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And it'd be interesting to go back one day and see how it felt without the people. I mean, one thing is that there's a lot of very rare species in there, and looking at it from a conservation point of view, I mean, at least the silver lining in that depopulation, as terrible as it is that perhaps the leopards in there and the tigers will, there'll be less human pressure on those species.
Yeah. Well, Peter Heller, we want to thank you for joining us today. And again, his book is Hell or Highwater. It's the journey down the Sangpo River, and believe me, it's something worth reading and taking a look at. Because we've talked with you about your book, Whale Watching, I'm just wondering what's next. Travel in a yellow submarine in the deep ocean depths? What is it that you plan on doing here in the future that I'm sure we're probably going to get a hold of and have you on the show?
Yeah, well, I'm very excited. The book, The Whale Warriors, just came out, and it's coming out in paperback in, I think, October. So it's called The Whale Warriors, Battle at the Bottom of the World to Save the Planet's Largest Mammals, the longest subtitle on Earth. But that was a couple of months with the vegan attack vessel, eco-pirate ship in Antarctica, hunting down the Japanese whaling fleet. I'm really excited about that. I'm doing some speaking about that now, heading to Australia on Saturday to go to the Writers' Festival there and talk about it. So that's really great. And now I'm working on a book about surfing and the oceans as well.
Oh, very good. Well, we're going to look forward to the possibility of having you on the program again, because surfing seems to be like the last bastion of the human experience outside of skydiving off of Everest, but I don't think anybody's going to want to try that. At least Ed Beasters won't let you anyway. So,
right,
Peter,
right.
It's been a pleasure to have you on our program, Peter. Again, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
I really appreciate it. Take care. Have a good one.
You
Bye-bye.
bet. All right, everybody. Again, Peter Heller, our guest today, here on the Beyond 50 radio program, and his book, Hell or High Water. I'm telling you, just reading the pace of this, you can feel the adventure as almost as if you're in it, as close as he could get to it anyway, as he was walking along the banks to help support this whole thing, as well as journaling it so people can feel and see and know the experience of that remote area, whereas Peter was talking about, you're seeing rare species that hopefully will be able to maintain their survival, as well as those rare Buddhist hunter tribes, which it sounds like the Chinese are trying to move those people out and basically control all that. Well, hopefully there may be some ways that we can present here on the Beyond 50 radio program that might help you find ways that you can get active to say, hey, why don't you just leave these things alone, because these are our brothers, our cousins. This is all part of who we are, the web of life. And I also encourage you, if you get an opportunity, to find that National Geographic documentary. It's called 2,000 Amazing Moments in Time. And pick up a copy of that, and you'll see what we're talking about. And that's just a glimpse of this mighty, powerful river that is basically in an area simply known as Shangri-La. I'm Daniel Davis. We want to thank all of you for joining us here. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Be sure to visit our website at beyond50radio.com. That is 50 with a 50, and subscribe for our free weekly e-newsletter. Comes out by email every Thursday, so you can find out what we're up to and what our upcoming guests are, and maybe catch some of our past shows that you may have missed. This is a worldwide broadcast. We want to thank the people from around the world for joining us today. And again, I'm Daniel Davis, and also on behalf of Peter Heller, we encourage all of you to live your day past halfway.